novels, but then I loved it in TV, movies. I was the biggest Lord of the Rings nerd ever. The movies came out when I was in high school, and this is like a random little story, but my mom actually called me the other week because they're renovating their house, and my mom was cleaning out my room and found these life-size cardboard cutouts of Frodo and Legolas and Eowyn stuffed into my closet. So my mom calls me, and she just says to me, "What did you and your friends do to Legolas?" Because there were like kiss marks like all over his face still, like 10 years later. And I was just like, "Mom, like you know that we were total weirdos, and like we like mauled him." So I was a big fantasy nerd. I love Star Wars. I'm actually wearing my Millennium Falcon t-shirt tonight because after 2.5 weeks on the road, all my fancy clothes are like really smelly, so I didn't want to like gross you guys out. So I figured I'd wear my nerd pride right out there in the open. So I was a big fantasy nut, and I read pretty much any fantasy book I could get my hands on when I was younger. But in 7th grade, I kind of decided that there were two parts of me. There was this like nerdy tomboy side, which I use with quotes now because I don't think that the fantasy stuff is nerdy at all. I think it's awesome. I don't think it's exclusive to boys. I think it's for everyone. But when I was 12, I thought that, only boys could like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Steven Spielberg movies, and that I had to kind of hide that because the other part of me was this girly girl side who loved makeup and nail polish and clothes and like giggling over boys. So I decided I was going to go with the girly girl box. I was going to pretend that the other part of me didn't really exist. So I stopped reading fantasy books. I stopped kind of watching the movies, and I just became like an airhead by choice. And I had this amazing teacher in 7th grade who actually noticed that I had become like willingly dumb. And he called my parents in for a parent-teacher conference, and he was like, Sarah is a relatively smart human being, but she's not reading anymore. She doesn't like the stuff we read in class, and I didn't. I hated the stuff I read in school because it didn't have magic or dragons or like anything fun or romantic, and it was really boring to me. But he said, take Sarah to the bookstore and let her pick out books that she wants to read. Don't pressure her into anything. Don't look down at anything she picks out. Just let her pick out whatever she wants to read and get her reading again because she needs to be reading. So my parents, because they are amazing, actually brought me to the bookstore that evening. And that day I walked out with 2 books. Garth Nix's Sabriel. I don't know if anyone knows that book. It's kind of old school fantasy at this point. And then Robin McKinley's Hero and the Crown, which is also old school fantasy. And those 2 books changed my life in a few ways, actually. One, they were about these fierce, independent heroines who got to do all the fun things that I'd wanted to do when I was younger. I would watch Star Wars, and I wanted to be Han Solo, or I wanted to be like Luke, battling Vader and getting my hand like chopped off. And in these books, the heroines, they had to make tough choices, and they got to save the day. And it was amazing to see that. And I realized like I didn't really have to pick between these 2 parts of me. I could still be a girly girl and giggle at boys, but I could also talk with them about Star Wars, and I didn't have to apologize for it. And I also realized that I still love fantasy, this like crazy, weird passion that was just like built in me from when I was born. And then the final thing I realized was that I wanted to write. I wanted to write stuff like what I just read. So I began writing, and I wrote really bad rip-offs of Sabriel and the Hero and the Crown, where like I pretty much like for those of you who have read Sabriel, or like my character, who I think was named like Sarah Riel or something, like it was clearly me, like self-insert, awful rip-offs. She went to the ball, and then like the dead showed up, and Sabriel had to like battle them like in the ball gown, and it was this combination of these 2 parts of me, because I wanted like more romance and more fancy dresses in my fantasy. So I began writing those awful rip-offs, and then I started writing fan fiction because I got into Harry Potter. The Harry Potter books were just starting to come out at that point, so I wrote Harry Potter Sailor Moon crossover fan fiction. It is like, okay, first of all, it was awesome. And this like now that I'm looking back at it, like the Sailor Scouts were sorted into houses, and like it was epic for like a 12, 13-year-old. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure they were awful, and they're like on floppy disks in like a junkyard somewhere, like in like a trash island in the sea, which is just a miracle. And yeah, so I knew that there was this website called fanfiction.net where people could go post their fan fiction and people could read it and review it all for free, and you could see it for any fandom at all. So I was reading my Harry Potter fan fiction and posting it there. And I did that for a couple of years, and then it wasn't until I was 16 years old and I was on winter break that I got the idea for the Throne of Glass. I was listening to the Cinderella soundtrack from the Disney movie, and I'm a huge Disney fan. I still am, and my phone case, this just proves what a nerd I am, is The Little Mermaid. It's like this beautiful illustration of The Little Mermaid, which is my favorite Disney movie. But music actually plays a huge role in my writing to this day, and it's kind of fitting that Throne of Glass actually came from a bit of music, because when I was listening to the Cinderella soundtrack, I thought that the music that plays when she flees the ball is actually like really dark and intense, like too intense for the scene, because if you watch the scene, she just danced with the prince. Like, she went there and had a nice time, and they had a very romantic moment. Then she tries to leave, and they send out the royal guard to hunt her down. And like, they're not just like, you know, like ridiculous, like frilly looking guards. Like, they're like all in black and riding black stallions and hunting her down. Like, if I was Cinderella, I never, ever would have gone back to that palace in a million years. So when I was listening to the music that's in that scene, I thought that the music would better suit a story where Cinderella had done something like really bad. Like, what if Cinderella was actually an assassin who had just tried to kill the prince? You know, what would that story be like? And as soon as I had that question, what if Cinderella was an assassin? I wanted to know who she was, how did she become an assassin, who had trained her, who had sent her to kill the prince, why had they sent her, what was her world like? I knew it was this fantasy world because, you know, I'd been reading and writing fantasy on my own for a while, and fantasy is like my default setting, and also the first Lord of the Rings film had just come out, so I was like uber into fantasy, and like the whole world was like full of Lord of the Rings glory. So as soon as I had that little kernel of idea, it was kind of my first like purely original idea. It was my own story, my own world, and I started daydreaming about this character, this young, infamous assassin, and the characters that she would meet. And I spent months just thinking about the story, kind of daydreaming in class when I should have been paying attention. I wasn't the best student in high school. I wasn't the worst, but I was like far, far from the best. And I would daydream on the bus to and from school. I would, you know, daydream instead of homework, which is probably why I wasn't the best student. And after a couple months, I finally decided, why not give it a shot? I'll write this story. So I wrote the first few chapters over my spring break of 10th grade, and I actually kind of liked it. I liked what I had written, and I realized I wanted to share it, because before I wrote more, I wanted to know if it was worth my while to even write more. And I had no one in my immediate life that was reading fantasy, writing, just writing in general, and I wanted feedback. And I knew that fanfiction.net had a sister site called fictionpress.com, where you could go post your original stories, and anyone could read them and review them. So I posted the first few chapters of Throne of Glass on Fiction Press, hoping that like one person and their cat would like it. Like, this is great, meow! I give you 10 fishes. I would have hoped for that, and instead the story kind of went viral. I had a flood of emails in my inbox from people saying, "These first few chapters are awesome. Can you write more?" In high school, I was actually pretty invisible. I didn't have that many friends. I had like 2 friends, and we were all kind of loners. And to go from that during the day to come home and find emails from people around the world who I'd never met saying that they loved my writing was a game changer. And I realized that I didn't just love sharing my stories. I wanted to be a published author so I could share them and maybe change someone's life in the way that, you know, the books I read when I was 12 years old changed my life. So I kept writing Throne of Glass. I wrote it through high school and through college for about 6 years. I wrote roughly the first 3 books in the series. The series now is going to be about 6 or 7 books. So I wrote kind of the first bit of the series. And as I wrote it, I would post chapters on Fiction Press. And in those years, Throne of Glass became the most reviewed story on Fiction Press, with thousands of fans from around the world. I would get fan mail and fan art from people in countries I'd never even heard of or been to, from Europe and Asia and Africa, and that was just mind-blowing to me. It still blows my mind. So I acquired this big fan base, and they were really vocal about wanting to see the book published. I would get emails from people saying, when will you try and get this published? I want to have it on my bookshelf. I want to see it in the bookstore. So they were really influential and really inspiring when it came time for me to finally take a step towards publication. In 2008, I graduated from college, and I decided that I was going to take that step toward publication. And that to do that, I had to do two things. One, I had to take the story off of Fiction Press because no publisher was going to buy the book. It was online for free. And then I also knew that I had to revise a lot of what I had written years ago, because that was written by a 16-year-old who had never written a book before, and who just had like really ridiculous passages like, Selena was the most beautiful girl who had ever existed. People wept tears of joy when they saw her because she was so beautiful and perfect. Stuff like that. That was just like by the time I finished writing the first 3 books, I was 22 years old, and I'd been writing so much and learned so much about writing that I could look back and be like, oh my god, like what is that? That needs to go. So I gutted the story. I tore things out, wrote in a bunch of new stuff. I rewrote it pretty much word for word. And I pulled it off Fiction Press, and that was terrifying because until that point, having my story on Fiction Press and having my fans was this thing that had defined me. And when stuff wasn't going so well at school or with friends or at home, I could still go online and have my fans and have this story. And taking it offline, I thought, like, what if that all goes away? What if this amazing thing that I've done is just this story I once tell people? And what if all these fans just vanish because they don't hear anymore? But they were so enthusiastic about the fact that I was taking it offline in order to get published that I had a little bit of hope that they'd stick around. So in late 2008, after revising the first book in the series a lot, I revised it, rewrote it, revised it some more. I sent it to critique partners, and they ripped it apart and helped me improve it. I finally sent it out to some agents, and about a month and a half later, I signed with my agent in early 2009, and then I worked with her on the book a bit. We revised it, tightened it, and then she went on maternity leave, so she was gone for a couple months. And then in fall 2009, we sent it out to publishers, and in March of 2010, Bloomsbury, my publisher, made their offer. And publishing takes a long, long time. And when Bloomsbury offered, they said that they expected the book to be out in late 2011, early 2012, which I thought, okay, I'll interpret that as late 2011. Wishful thinking. I thought, like by my will, I could make it come out like earlier. And my fans from Fiction Press were still sticking around. They flipped when they heard the news that I'd sold the book to Bloomsbury. But then they were also like, why do we have to wait like 2 years for the book to come out? Because they also didn't know that publishing took a long time. I learned a lot about publishing just by going through it all. So once I began working with my editor, she read the book, and it took her 6 months to get me my edit letter. I love my editor. She is amazing, but it took her a very long time to get my edit letter to me. And by the time I did get it, it became apparent that fall 2011 wasn't going to happen, and that it was going to be early 2012. And so I was okay with that. It wasn't that big of a delay. And then I found out that they actually wanted it to come out in fall 2012, an extra 6 months later. And I was really upset because I thought, oh my god, it's another 6 months. My fans are going to be like mortified, and like they're going to be so mad at me. And one of my friends who works in publishing was actually like, child, shut up. First of all, this is amazing. Because I didn't know this until I went through it. But fall books are kind of called lead titles, and they're like the blockbuster books for publishers, and to be a fall title is a big deal. So the fact that Bloomsbury decided they wanted to give it that much of a push, even though it meant a delay, was an amazing thing.
So, once I accepted that this would be out in fall 2012, almost a year later than I'd initially hoped, I called my agent and I was like, even though I understand, why they're having this delay and why it's a good thing, I feel really bad for my fiction press fans who are still around and still so excited for this story, but who will have to wait another 6 months for it. What can we do to make the wait less miserable? So we talked about it for a while, and then we came up with this idea of doing these 4 prequel novellas that would be ebooks and set before the events of Throne of Glass. And they would each be a standalone, but together all 4 would kind of form the arc of how Selena, my heroine, wound up in slavery, which is how she begins Throne of Glass, how she went from being the world's best assassin to being thrown into the salt mines. It's kind of the story of her downfall. And I was so excited by this idea, and especially because it was kind of a way of giving back to the old fans and maybe inviting new fans to get excited about the books, that we pitched it to Bloomsbury, and they got on board instantly. And Bloomsbury actually decided that they were going to do this grand rollout, where starting in January 2012, they were going to release the first novella, and then every couple of months they'd release a next one leading up to the August 2012 release. So that's what they did, and the novellas kind of took off, and they're still selling really well as ebooks, and they've done so well that I found out this spring they're actually binding them up, plus a 5th new novella as like a real solid book. Thank you for being excited about that. It's going to be called The Assassin's Blade, and it'll feature all 5 novellas plus some extra content, and I don't know what other goodies they'll throw in, and that's all because people got so excited by the novellas and love them so much, and they're so vocal about loving them that my publisher listened, which is wonderful. So Throne of Glass came out in August 2012, 2.5 years after I sold it to Bloomsbury, and over 10 years after I first got the idea for it. And the past year has been the best year of my life. We sold rights in 16 countries so far, plus the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. And I found out a couple days ago that we just sold rights in the Netherlands, which is insane. I've never been there. It blows my mind that my book will be out in countries where I can't speak the language, and people around the world can pick it up and read it. And I've gone to conventions and conferences and had wonderful events and done lots of school visits and met so many great people. And then Crown of Midnight came out, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? My sense of time is like totally whacked. And I found out a week after it came out that it hit the New York Times bestseller list and the USA Today bestseller list. And then I found out last night that it stayed on the New York Times list, which blows my mind. Most days I actually think I'm going to wake up and still be 16 years old and like emo with my Legolas like covered in kissy marks. And I dreamed big, but I never thought that any of this amazing stuff would happen. I've been on tour for the past 2.5 weeks, going around the country. Another thing I never thought would happen. Touring is a big deal, and the fact that Bloomsbury believes enough in me and the books to want to send me across the country is crazy. And actually, I'm published by Bloomsbury in the UK as well, and they're sending me over to the UK in 2 weeks for a tour in the UK, Ireland, and Germany, where I'll be having events and going to schools, and that I haven't even processed that really. I feel like I won't process it until I'm actually, in London having an event. And it's like I can't nothing cool ever happened to me in my life. I spend most of my days in dirty yoga pants and old t-shirts. So it's almost like it happened to someone else, and it's crazy. It's all been crazy and wonderful, and just the best ride of my life. And that's kind of how I got to be here. This is the very last stop on my tour. I go home tomorrow morning, and I get to see my husband and my dog. I miss my dog more than my husband. I don't know what that says. I love my husband. He's amazing. But I love my dog. I got her when she was 10 weeks old, and she's I'm a full-time writer now, which is also crazy. I can support myself through my writing, which is unreal. But my dog spends 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with me, so we're weirdly emotionally attached. So when I go away, I cry for days before because I can't bear the thought of being separated from my dog. Then my husband, I'm like, all right, honey, see you later. I actually begged him to bring the dog to the airport tomorrow to pick me up. And he's like, no, like, I'm not, like, taking an extra hour out of, like, the route to go pick up the dog, like, so she can be there in the car. But I'm a little sad to be done with the tour, because it was really fun going around the country and meeting all different kinds of people. And yeah, I guess I can open it up to questions if you guys have any. Happy to answer anything. You know, what trashy TV I watch. The answer is Honey Boo Boo. I actually still love that show. I feel like it's like passe now, but I still love it. And I actually, this is good TV. I just got into Teen Wolf. I don't know if you guys watch that, but like I did not think I would become as addicted as I did. I sat on my couch for 3 days, like eating Cheetos and popcorn and beer, and like didn't move. And like at times I was like on the ground, like sobbing hysterically, like over Teen Wolf. Like this is like an MTV show. Like MTV is doing something like special, and it reminds me of like the early seasons of Buffy. You guys watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer? It's like that kind of like quirky, fun. Like it doesn't take itself too seriously, but then the moments when it all comes together, like have that punch that just like devastate you. So I am like a Teen Wolf fanatic. I feel like I've talked about it at every event I've gone to because I can't shut up about how much I've started rewatching the series. Like I'm already halfway through season 1 again, which yeah, I should be writing. But nope, I'm binging Teen Wolf. Sorry, Bloomsbury. So questions on that note.
What was your major in college?
I was a creative writing major, big surprise. I actually started out as a comparative literature major. Then I found out to be one, I would have to take 2 years of like really intense foreign language study, and like I barely got through French in high school, like barely passed every year. So I said, nope, I'll just do creative writing. So again, with the great student thing. I'm a horrible role model. But I actually didn't even want to be a creative writing major when I started, because in high school I took a creative writing elective, and I had this horrible teacher who, when I submitted like this little fantasy project I worked on, spent the entire 45 minutes when she was supposed to be workshopping my piece, ripping apart the fantasy genre, saying that fantasy books weren't real books. At the time, Philip Pullman's Golden Compass series was like really hot, and she spent a good chunk of time saying that Philip Pullman was a hack. And I walked out of that class so furious that I actually like went home and wrote this like diary entry in my online blog that I found a couple years ago. It's so horrible. I was such an awful human being when I was like 17. But I basically said, this is like word for word. I'm not going to use her name, but I hope Mrs. So-and-so is crushed to death by a giant box of fantasy books. I wrote, like, in my, like, public online journal that, like, I shouldn't have, like, had, like, be public, but, like, the internet was so new then, I didn't know better. But she, like, scared me off of taking creative writing classes, because I figured that they would all be just as bad. And then, you know, when I was a comparative literature major and found out that I had to take language stuff, I decided I'd face my fear of creative writing classes and be a creative writing major, and they were better than that. I had great professors, and the students were really nice, but I definitely had to kind of prove myself to them more than the average student writing a contemporary, very literary type piece of fiction, because I still wrote about fairy tales and dragons and unicorns. I don't think I actually wrote about unicorns in my creative writing stuff, but there were princesses and dragons, but I made them work, you know, like it wasn't just silly stuff. I, you know, made them work as if they were, you know, real books, and my professors loved it, despite themselves, and they actually told me, you know, despite myself, despite not liking fantasy, you get an A. And I was like, well, okay. So I graduated top of my class, but it's kind of, you know, I was good at writing, so I wasn't like a pre-med who like struggled and like, you know, had like really intense classes. I mostly took classes I was really interested in, which is why I loved college. I hated high school, but college was the best. I took courses on Russian folklore. I love Russian mythology. And my favorite class ever was called Buffy and the Gothic Novel, where we would read a Gothic novel, a traditional Gothic novel, and then we would watch an episode of Buffy that used similar elements or was inspired by that novel. And that was like no one ever missed that class. No one ever showed up late. The professor was amazing. Like she would wear like combat boots and have like tons of piercings, and she would sit on top of the table and talk to us like we were like real people and not little minions. And she was actually a big inspiration for me and a wonderful person because this is like really embarrassing, but I became like uber preppy in college. Like I don't know what happened. Like maybe an alien like took over my brain. And I went from being this like wannabe punk rock emo kid in high school to like uber prep in college. And so no one really knew that I was writing. I didn't let my I certainly did not wear Millennium Falcon t-shirts in college. And somehow I guess I trusted her enough. I thought she was cool enough. It kind of got me that I told her, I write. I have this story online, thousands of fans. And she actually invited me to meet with her once a week the next semester to read my writing and give me feedback and kind of coach me on what first steps I'd have to take in the publishing journey. And she didn't have to do that. She was just a really cool person who saw that writing was what I wanted to do and that I wanted to be a published author. And to this day, we still talk. I'm actually going back to my college in a couple weeks for Fall Coming, which is like our annual fall celebration, and I'm going to see her for the first time since 2007. And I thank her in my books because I had that awful high school creative writing teacher, but then I had some amazing teachers who made a huge difference in my life. So I'm very grateful for her. You in the second row, yeah.
I want to be a writer someday.
Yay!
What would you suggest?
That's a tough question. I have kind of crappy advice because one, I think you should just read as much as you can, which is pretty easy advice. But I learned so much about storytelling just through reading and reading books that I loved. I learned some stuff from what I read in school. But I learned more from reading books that made me come alive, from books that left a hole in my heart. And then, after I'd read them, sometimes I'd think about what parts did I love or not like. This is another kind of crappy answer, but write as often as you can. And again, write what you love. I tried writing stuff that I thought would be, well received, like literary, depressing pieces, and it crushed my soul. I couldn't do it. And once I tried it, I decided I would never again apologize for writing the stuff that I loved. So I just kept writing, and I wrote whenever I could. Sometimes instead of school stuff, again with the bad role model thing. But I would write on weekends and vacations. And I guess my other bit of advice is that a lot of people are going to tell you can't do it, or that what you write isn't real literature. Just ignore them. If I'd ever listened to any of the people that told me I couldn't do it, I wouldn't be where I am today. My parents are really supportive of my writing, but they definitely were like, you need to have realistic expectations about, just getting published and, being a full-time writer. And I understand why they did that. I think if, when I have kids, I'll probably, if they want to be writers, I'll tell them the same thing. I've gotten very lucky with what's happened to me. I'm totally not the norm, and I'm thankful for that every day in my life. But still, I had lots of people tell me it wasn't, a viable career path, and that I couldn't ever be published. And the only person that can ever get you to stop writing, eventually get you to never be published, is you. You give up. So don't give up, no matter what people say. Even if it's your friends who say nasty stuff, ignore them. If writing's what makes you come alive, do it. And you'll always find ways to do it. Try to set aside time if you can. Even just a couple hundred words a day or even a week. Set goals if that helps you. And set realistic goals too. Don't say I want to be published by the time I'm 21. Just say I want to finish a manuscript this year, because that's a goal you can control. You can't control if you're going to be published or not. So much of this is luck. My book was right time, right place, right people. It was the stars aligning. And so many amazing books never get published just because it's not the right time, or it's not the right people. But you can control writing a book, and then if that one doesn't sell, write the next one. Set goals that you can achieve, because that will definitely bolster your confidence and keep you going. I don't know if that's if that was useful in any way, but it's a long, it's not an easy journey. If it was easy, anyone can do it. stuff's happened, it's made me enjoy it even more. So it's all worth it. I wouldn't trade a single second of it for the bad stuff, because it would mean none of this would have happened. Other questions? Yes.
The important question: who would you pick if you could choose between Kale and Dorian?
Oh, I can't answer that without spoiling things. Especially because I'm working on book 3 and stuff changes. I don't know. I feel like if you read Crown of Midnight, you'll know what my preference is. But it changes actually. I try to stay flexible. I know how the series ends, but I also believe in trusting my gut. And if stuff isn't working, and my instincts are telling me to go in another direction, or suddenly characters that I did not expect to have chemistry have crazy chemistry, I'll listen to that and I'll go in that direction. So writing book 3, which won't be out I guess until fall 2014, so next year. I realized some things when writing that game changer type stuff. So, but I like Kale, I guess I'll say that. I love him. I like the broody guys. When I was younger, I was more into the prince, like Dorian types. Now that I'm older, I like the kind of alpha male broody dudes.
As long as no one dies.
Yeah.
As long as Kale doesn't die.
I can't.
Don't kill
guarantee
Kale,
anything.
please.
No, I can guarantee that Fleetfoot the dog won't ever die. That's the only. She makes it to the end, but I don't know about anyone else. It's the worst answer ever, but I could never kill a dog. I just watched the new Riddick movie, which just came out. It's
With
I don't know
Vin
if
Diesel?
anyone saw that except for me.
With Vin Diesel?
Yeah, and there's a dog-like character. It's not a dog, but it's this alien type creature that is a dog, and it dies in the movie. And I actually had to turn away from the screen. I can watch people having their guts ripped out and thrown in the air, and not blink. My husband, I've taken my husband to the ER, and he's been bleeding and cut up, and the nurses were like, do you need to sit down? And I'd be like, no, I'm fine. I want to watch you stitch him up. But seeing this dog creature die, I actually had to close my eyes, and I plugged my ears. I